Hey there, today we're looking at a comparison of Valorant running between the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U and the Intel i5 1135G7. Both of these chips are more than capable of running this esports title, but there is going to be some differences in terms of the level of performance that you get out of both of them. Now, what you're looking at on the screen right now is the game running at 1080p with all of the graphics settings either set to low or off. The only thing that's turned up is the textures, which are set to medium, and both of the systems that I have right now are running at their stock setting, which is 15 watts. Now, at these settings, we're getting some very nice performance from both of them, but really they are not comparable in the slightest. The Ryzen 5 is pretty much giving us a high refresh rate experience with 1% lows that, while do dip below 60, they don't dip as much as they do on the i5. And you'll notice that on the i5 there are just more spikes in the frame times. It's just overall not as smooth of an experience. And interestingly enough, it's also using more RAM, even though both are set to the same exact setting. Now, this extra RAM usage really doesn't matter for anything because of the fact that both systems have 16 gigabytes of RAM. Neither one is going to be running into issues here. But you can definitely tell that at least at these stock settings, both chips are able to do a decent enough job, but there is a noticeable difference between the two. The i5 just cannot hit as high a frame rates. Their 1% lows are comparable enough, and really it's the fact that those 1% lows are even remotely comparable is what makes this not a complete destruction by the AMD chip here. But for sure, the fact that we could actually get a high refresh rate experience out of there, I mean, like, it's pretty much at this point a 40 FPS average deficit. We can definitely see that the Ryzen 5 is just doing a much better job, and this is very comparable because these two compete with each other in the same price range. And a lot of the time, these cheaper systems kind of just really don't let you turn up a lot of these settings. So there might be a lot of you that just cannot turn up past 15 watts on either the i5 or the Ryzen 5. And in those situations, well, you can see here which one is the clear winner. But if we do turn up the setting, now on my i5, I can only go up to a maximum of 20 watts before it just downclocks itself down to just 20 watts. So that seems to be a hard limit. So I pretty much just put both chips to 20 watts so that we get at least comparable levels of performance there. So once things get raised to 20 watts, you can actually see something interesting happen here. The 1% lows get a noticeable uplift on both systems, though the one that benefits the most is pretty much the i5. Both of them end up producing 1% lows that are pretty much in the 60 FPS range, but you can still see that the Ryzen 5 is just giving us a much higher FPS average. So while both are relatively consistent, you will see that the i5 does struggle in some situations and will dip down, though usually those situations are when spawning in. When actually playing the game, the performance is overall consistent. So you can see that both chips definitely benefited from that OC, but really the Ryzen 5 is just giving us a much more consistent experience. It's really not dipping down anywhere near what the i5 is. And this has been over multiple runs. I pretty much did at least 3 games for each chip, and I kind of just picked a random run that was like at least consistent enough with all the others. I didn't want to just pick an outlier one that was like, a cherry pick situation. So this was pretty much just how it would consistently end up performing like, which means that overall the Ryzen 5 is just going to give you a consistent, smooth experience, while the Ryzen 5 is going to keep that same level of consistency. It's just not going to give you as high of an FPS. Both are perfectly playable, and I don't really think that if you have an i5 right now, you should feel disappointed. You're at least going to be able to play the game, but definitely if you have a Ryzen 5 right now, you're probably smiling very hard because you made a very solid choice here. And I don't think that either chip is really wrong to go with. It all just comes down to the price. But if you're definitely paying around $1,000 for a system with this i5, it's going to be rough when you see systems that are half the price that are giving you a much better gaming experience overall. But when you can pick up a refurbished gateway laptop with this i5 and 16 gigabytes of RAM for just $300, I really don't think that in that scenario you're going to be looking at these numbers and just really feel that heartbroken that you didn't spend an extra $200 for the Ryzen 5 instead. And with that being said, another thing about the Ryzen 5 is that it does let you actually turn things up even more. You can go all the way up to 25 watts. Past that, it really actually starts to hit dangerous levels of temperature, but 25 watts is doable here, and it does improve the performance just a tiny bit. It's really not anywhere near as noticeable. It's just one of those things where the 1% lows are just going to be even more consistent. The averages are looking rock solid at 120, and it's really just demonstrating how much better it is over the i5. Again, the i5 is not a terrible choice because you are still able to play the game, and it's one of those things where you're not going to be absolutely awful at it or anything like that. It's perfectly playable. It's just nowhere near the same experience as the Ryzen 5 here. And when you can get pretty much equally priced systems here, well, it's hard to really make a case for the i5, especially with its pretty major core deficit. And really, all this shows me is that the Ryzen 5 is just the smartest choice to go with, unless you can get a very, very good deal on the i5. And even then, I mean, seeing the performance difference, maybe the $200 and maybe just the difference is $100 for you. Maybe in those situations, it's kind of worth going with the Ryzen 5, even if it's more expensive. Because I mean, which system is going to probably end up lasting you longer? I would argue that Ryzen 5 is probably going to age better because it has more cores. You know, 4 cores, 8 threads is very limiting at this point. That i5 is really barely on the edge of reasonable usability, while 6 cores, 12 threads is pretty much going to stay relevant for a very, very long time. And I mean, if there's anything that we've found over the years, is that core count is one of those things that makes chips age beautifully. Because you could get one of those old Xeons from like 2010, like I think it was Random HD. He pretty much did a video showing a old Xeon that was like a 6-core chip, and it still held up in a lot of modern games because of the fact that, I mean, back then 6 cores was very specialized specifically to servers because most programs weren't really designed to use multiple cores. But you know, the technology caught up, and that chip is still decent enough today, over a decade later after it was released. A lot of the times, the things that are holding back these old multi-core CPUs is actually just the fact they're missing modern instruction sets. I would not be surprised if like a Phenom processor would actually hold up pretty decently today if it actually supported modern AVX systems.